December 18, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The morning fog clung to the frozen earth like a burial shroud. Through the skeletal remains of pine trees, their trunks splintered by artillery, came the mechanical growl of diesel engines, low, guttural, predatory. Oberfeldwebel Hans Becker pressed his face against the periscope glass inside his Panther Ausf. G. Breath condensing in small clouds despite the cramped warmth of 5 bodies sharing steel. The frost on the outside of his vision port fractured the pale December light into 1,000 tiny prisms. His hands, wrapped in wool that could never quite keep the cold at bay, rested on the commander's override controls. Through the narrow slit of reinforced glass, he watched the road ahead disappear into white obscurity. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog and the shattered tree line, American forces were retreating. The radio crackled with reports, enemy columns falling back toward Bastogne, supply lines stretched thin, defensive positions hastily abandoned. This was it. This was the moment every man in the 5th Panzer Army had been promised. The great thrust westward, the counteroffensive that would split the Allied armies in two, recapture Antwerp, force the British and Americans to sue for peace. And they had the tools to do it. Becker's hand moved almost unconsciously to touch the thick glacis plate beside him. 80 millimeters of face-hardened steel sloped at 55 degrees. Mathematically, effectively, 140 millimeters of protection against any shell the Americans could field. The Panther was invincible. Everyone said so. The engineers at Man, the test crews at Kummersdorf, even the grizzled veterans who'd survived Kursk, they all spoke of the Panther's frontal armor as if it were a religious certainty. The column moved forward. 15 Panthers in staggered formation, accompanied by Panzer grenadiers riding on the engine decks and clinging to the spare track links. They carried the confidence of men who believed in their machines. The Panther had been designed to kill the Soviet T-34 at ranges where the Russian tank couldn't even scratch German armor. Its 75 mkw K-42 L-70 gun could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to destroy any Sherman the Americans possessed. In the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare, the Panther seemed to hold every advantage. Weight, 45 tons of refined German engineering. Speed, 34 miles per hour on roads, faster than most Allied tanks. Protection, frontal armor that Allied intelligence reports described with grudging respect as extremely difficult to penetrate with available weapons. But the fog that morning was thicker than tactical wisdom. It swallowed the column whole, reduced visibility to less than 50 meters, turned the familiar mechanics of tank warfare into something else entirely. A blind stumbling into unknown space, where all the careful calculations of armor thickness and gun penetration dissolved into white uncertainty. What the Germans advancing through the Ardennes that winter believed, what they had been told, what experience had taught them, was that the Panther represented the apex of armored design. They had seen Sherman tanks brew up after a single penetrating hit, watched American armor recoil from German positions, listened to intelligence reports describing captured American tankers as demoralized and outgunned. The Panther's reputation had been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front, where it had proven itself against Soviet heavy armor. Tank for tank, gun for gun, the mathematics seemed incontestable. An American Sherman carried a 75 mm3 gun that could barely penetrate 68 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. Useless against the Panther's frontal plate. Even the improved 76 mm Sherman, which began appearing in larger numbers by late 1944, could only penetrate the Panther's glacis at point-blank range, and only with specific ammunition that wasn't always available. This confidence wasn't mere propaganda. It was rooted in engineering reality and battlefield experience. At Kursk, at Normandy, in dozens of smaller engagements across France and Belgium, Panthers had proven devastatingly effective when properly deployed. German tank commanders had learned to use range and armor as force multipliers, engaging Allied tanks from distances where return fire was ineffective. The psychological effect was sometimes as important as the physical. Allied tankers developed what American after-action reports called a Panther phobia, a reluctance to engage the German tanks in direct combat, a tendency to call for air support or artillery rather than risk frontal assault. But wars are not won by individual weapon systems, no matter how sophisticated. They are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to field not just superior machines, but sufficient numbers of adequate ones supported by every element of combined arms warfare. And in the winter of 1944, the Americans were learning lessons that would shatter the myth of the invincible Panther. The fog began to lift around mid-morning, torn apart by a wind that came sharp and cold from the northwest. Visibility improved to perhaps 300 meters, enough to see the road ahead winding through a small valley between two wooded ridges. Enough to see the burned-out hulks of American vehicles from earlier fighting, abandoned half-tracks and supply trucks that had been pushed to the roadside. The Panther column maintained formation, commanders scanning the tree lines through their periscopes, gunners testing their traverses, drivers negotiating the ice-slicked road with the kind of careful attention that kept 45-ton machines from sliding into ditches. They were 2 kilometers past the village of Krinkelt when the first Panther died. No warning, no muzzle flash visible through the remaining fog, just a sound like a giant hammer striking steel, and the third Panther in column erupted in a gout of orange flame that turned black before it fully cleared the turret. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch and vision port. Becker saw it through his periscope, one moment a functioning machine, the next a metal coffin burning its crew alive. The radio exploded with shouted reports, overlapping voices trying to identify the threat. Contact front. Where? I didn't see. Evasive action. The column scattered, Panthers pivoting on their tracks, searching for targets that refused to materialize. 15 seconds later, the lead Panther took a hit that penetrated the turret ring and detonated the ammunition stowage. The explosion was so violent it blew the turret completely off the hull, sent it spinning through the air to land 20 meters away upside down in a frozen drainage ditch. And still no visible enemy, no muzzle flashes, no tank silhouettes on the ridgeline, just invisible death arriving at supersonic velocity from unknown positions. What the Germans were experiencing, though they didn't yet fully understand it, was the American tank destroyer doctrine in its most refined and lethal form. While the Wehrmacht had designed the Panther as a main battle tank, meant to close with and destroy enemy armor while also supporting infantry and holding ground, the Americans had taken a different philosophical approach. They had separated the anti-tank mission from the general-purpose mission, creating a specialized weapon system optimized for one thing only: killing tanks at range. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer was not designed to charge enemy positions or hold territory. It carried minimal armor, maximum 31 millimeters on the frontal hull, just enough to stop small arms fire and shell fragments. It was fast, mobile, and mounted a 9mm M3 gun that could penetrate 188 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters with standard ammunition. Against the Panther's side armor, 50 millimeters at vertical, or the thinner roof and rear plates, it was absolutely devastating. But the genius of the tank destroyer was not just the gun. It was the doctrine. American tank destroyer battalions trained relentlessly in ambush tactics. They learned to use terrain for concealment, to fire from defilade positions where only the gun barrel was exposed, to shoot and scoot before return fire could find them. They operated in hunter-killer teams, often with forward observers calling in targets, with infantry support securing their flanks, with carefully pre-sighted firing positions that allowed them to cover multiple avenues of approach. They didn't fight fair. They didn't give the enemy the tank versus tank duel that German crews expected and trained for. They simply killed from positions of advantage and disappeared. In the valley outside Krinkelt that morning, the M36 crews had positioned themselves on the wooded ridgelines with perfect fields of fire down the road. They had line of sight to 800 meters, well within the effective range of their 90 guns, but far enough that the remaining fog and terrain gave them concealment. They had been waiting for 6 hours since before dawn, cold and patient in positions they'd selected the previous afternoon. They had marked ranges to specific landmarks, that burned truck, that road junction, that particular tree, so they could engage with minimal adjustment. And they had been told exactly what was coming. American intelligence, pieced together from air reconnaissance and radio intercepts, knew that 5th Panzer Army was pushing toward Bastogne along this axis. The 3rd M36 fired. Another Panther exploded, this time penetrated through the thinner side armor as it pivoted to search for threats. The 9mm HVAP round, high-velocity armor-piercing, with a tungsten carbide core, went through the hull like a nail through cardboard, fragmented inside the crew compartment, ignited the ammunition racks. The tank burned with that peculiar intensity that comes from mixing diesel fuel, propellant charges, and human bodies in a sealed steel container heated to incineration temperature. The surviving Panthers began firing back, main guns booming, high-explosive shells impacting the ridgelines. But they were shooting at shadows and guesses. The tank destroyers had been dug in, camouflaged, positioned in prepared hides that were almost impossible to spot until they fired. And even when they fired, the low profile of the M36 turret and the careful positioning meant that German return fire was largely wasted against terrain and trees. This was the nightmare scenario that German tank doctrine had never adequately addressed. The Panther had been designed to fight other tanks in mobile warfare, where superior optics and gun range would allow it to kill enemies before they could close to effective range. But what happened when the enemy refused to close? What happened when they occupied terrain that negated the Panther's range advantage? When they attacked from concealment at distances where even the vaunted German optics couldn't acquire targets? What happened when the careful mathematics of armor thickness became irrelevant because the enemy wasn't shooting at the front? Becker's Panther took a hit in the engine deck. The shell, 90 mm, high velocity, fired from a position on the north ridgeline that no one had spotted, punched through the thinner rear armor and wrecked the Maybach engine. The tank filled with smoke instantly, that acrid chemical smoke that meant fuel lines had been cut and fire was imminent. Becker screamed the evacuation order, popped his hatch, dragged himself out into the freezing air. His driver and bow gunner belayed out the front. The gunner and loader came tumbling through the turret hatch behind him. They threw themselves into the roadside ditch, pressed themselves into the frozen mud, while their tank burned and the battle continued to rage around them. From the ditch, Becker watched the systematic destruction of his company. The American tank destroyers worked with mechanical efficiency, killing Panthers one by one, reloading and firing with a rhythm that spoke of extensive training and carefully rehearsed drill. Some Panthers managed to return fire effectively. One M36 was hit and disabled, its crew evacuating under covering fire from infantry. But the exchange rate was devastating. 7 Panthers destroyed outright, 3 more damaged and immobilized, in less than 10 minutes of engagement. The surviving German tanks withdrew in disorder, retreating back down the road they'd advanced along so confidently an hour before. The after-action report filed by the commander of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion 3 days later was matter-of-fact in its accounting. 8 Panthers destroyed, 2 damaged. 1 M36 lost, 2 crew wounded. Ammunition expenditure, 62 rounds of 9mm. The report noted with professional satisfaction that the pre-sighted positions had worked as planned, that the coordination with forward observers had been excellent, that the doctrine of engage and withdraw had prevented the Germans from fixing the American position for counter-battery fire or airstrikes. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the fundamental shift those numbers represented, a shift in the entire calculus of armored warfare that the Germans, for all their engineering brilliance and tactical experience, had failed to anticipate. The Panther had been designed in 1942 in response to the shocking appearance of the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front. It represented the finest thinking of German tank designers, men who understood ballistics and metallurgy and the complex interplay of weight, armor, mobility, and firepower. They had created a weapon system that, on paper and often in practice, was superior to anything the Allies could field. But they had designed it for a specific kind of war: mobile warfare on the open steppes of Russia, tank versus tank duels at long range, battles of maneuver where superior optics and gun performance would prove decisive. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They had the industrial capacity to produce not just good tanks, but vast numbers of adequate tanks supported by overwhelming artillery, air power, and logistics. They could afford to lose 3 Shermans for every Panther if it meant their armies kept advancing. More importantly, they had developed tactics and weapon systems specifically designed to neutralize the Panthers' advantages. The tank destroyer doctrine was only part of it. American tankers learned to use combined arms tactics, to never engage Panthers alone but always with infantry support, artillery on call, fighter bombers overhead. They learned to use terrain, to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, to accept that they couldn't win fair fights, and so they simply refused to fight fair. The 9mm gun that armed the M36 had originally been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon. It was adapted for anti-tank use, because American ordnance officers recognized that the standard 75mm and 76mm guns were inadequate against German heavy armor. The 9mm was a brute, longer recoil stroke, heavier mount, more difficult to stabilize, but it worked. It could penetrate any German tank from the front at combat ranges. And the Americans produced it in quantity, mounted it on the hastily designed M36 chassis, which was itself based on the M10 chassis, which was based on the M4 Sherman. An entire family tree of expedient design and rapid production that valued getting effective weapons into the field over achieving engineering perfection. This was the lesson the Germans learned, vehicle by vehicle, in the killing fields of the Ardennes. The Panther was a magnificent tank, but magnificence without numbers, without fuel, without air superiority, without the industrial capacity to replace losses, magnificence alone could not win wars. Oberfeldwebel Becker and his surviving crew walked 9 kilometers through the snow to reach German lines. They passed more burned Panthers, more wrecked vehicles, more evidence of an offensive that was rapidly losing momentum. The promised breakthrough to Antwerp seemed like a fever dream, something imagined in the desperate optimism of high command, rather than grounded in the reality of what was possible with the forces actually available. Becker's crew would be reassigned to another Panther within 48 hours. The Wehrmacht still had tanks, though fewer with each passing day, and crews were becoming more valuable than machines. He would fight in the Ardennes for another 3 weeks before the entire offensive collapsed. He would survive the war, one of the relative few who did, carrying with him the memory of that morning in the fog when the invincible armor proved tragically vulnerable. The mythology of the Panther persisted long after the war. Tank enthusiasts and military historians would debate its merits, compare armor thickness and gun penetration values, construct elaborate what-if scenarios. Some would argue that if only the Germans had produced more Panthers, if only they'd had adequate fuel and air cover, if only they'd used them more carefully, the outcome might have been different. But this misses the essential point. The Panthers' technical superiority was real but ultimately irrelevant because war is not an engineering problem to be solved by better machines. It is a human endeavor, messy and improvisational, one by the side that can field adequate forces in sufficient numbers with sustainable logistics and effective combined arms doctrine. The American response to the Panther wasn't to build a better tank, though they eventually did. It was to develop tactics and weapons that made the Panther's advantages irrelevant. The tank destroyer battalions were part of this. So were the fighter-bombers that hunted German armor from the air. So were the artillery battalions that could drop time-on-target concentrations that bracketed German positions with such devastating precision that no amount of armor could protect the vehicles inside. So was the entire logistics apparatus that kept American forces supplied even during the most desperate moments of the Battle of the Bulge. While German units ran out of fuel and ammunition and simply stopped moving, their technically superior tanks reduced to static pillboxes waiting for destruction. By January 1945, the initial shock of the German offensive had been absorbed. American forces had stabilized the lines, reinforced Bastogne, begun the methodical process of pushing the Germans back. The Wehrmacht committed its last reserves of armor to the Ardennes and saw them destroyed piecemeal, lost to a combination of enemy action, mechanical breakdown, and simple lack of fuel. The Panthers that survived were withdrawn, reorganized into diminishing numbers of understrength units, committed to increasingly desperate defensive battles as the Allies closed in from west and east. The M36 tank destroyer would remain in service for decades after the war, exported to Allied nations, used in conflicts from Korea to the Indo-Pakistani wars. It was never the most elegant weapon system, never the most sophisticated, but it was effective, and it was available in numbers when it mattered most. The American approach to military production, good enough, fast enough, in sufficient quantity, had proven itself against what many considered the finest tank in the world. There is a photograph, taken in late January 1945 near the village of Houffalize, that captures something essential about the Battle of the Bulge. It shows 3 destroyed Panthers in a field covered with snow. They sit at odd angles, turrets twisted, hulls penetrated, the black marks of fire staining the winter white around them. In the foreground, partially obscured by the nearest Panther, is an M36 tank destroyer. Its crew is standing next to it, 5 men in winter gear, hands in pockets, posture casual. They are not posing dramatically. They are not celebrating. They look cold and tired and ready to move on to the next position. The photograph is taken from a distance that makes the men small against the hulking mass of destroyed German armor, but somehow this only emphasizes the point. The individual soldiers are small, the individual machines are just machines, but the system that produced them and employed them and sustained them in battle, that was the real weapon. The German faith in their armor was not foolish. It was based on genuine technical superiority and real battlefield success. The Panther's thick frontal armor did protect against most Allied anti-tank weapons at medium range. The 75mm gun did outrange and outperform most Allied tank guns. The optics were genuinely superior, but faith in technology, however well-founded, could not overcome the fundamental disparities in industrial capacity, logistics, and adaptable tactical doctrine that characterized the Allied approach to warfare. The tank destroyers that burned Panthers in the Ardennes were not miracle weapons. They were expedient solutions to a specific problem, produced rapidly, employed effectively, supported by everything else the American war machine could bring to bear. They succeeded not because they were perfect, but because they were good enough and available in quantity. This was the American way of war, overwhelming material superiority applied with reasonable competence over sustained periods. It was not glamorous. It did not inspire the same kind of mythic respect as German technical sophistication. But in the end, in the frozen fields of Belgium and the forests of the Ardennes, it worked. The snow that winter covered German and American dead alike, made no distinction between the crew of a destroyed Panther and the crew of a disabled Sherman or burning M36. The metal hulks would be cleared eventually, some salvaged for scrap, others pushed into ravines or buried where they fell. The soldiers who survived would go home and try to make sense of what they'd experienced, to reconcile the industrial scale of mechanized warfare with the intimate human scale of fear and cold and dead friends. What remained, beyond the immediate tactical lessons and the strategic outcomes, was a demonstration of a fundamental truth about modern war. Technology matters, but it is not decisive in itself. The best tank, the best gun, the best armor, these are advantages, but only advantages. They can be overcome by numbers, by tactics, by the industrial capacity to produce adequate weapons in overwhelming quantity. The Germans trusted their Panther armor because they had good reason to, because it had served them well, because the mathematics of penetration and protection seemed irrefutable. But mathematics cannot account for the fog of war, for the hunter-killer teams waiting in ambush, for the simple brutal fact that even the thickest armor has weak points, and even the best tank can only be in one place at one time. The Panthers burned not because they were poorly designed, but because they were fighting a war that could not be won by design alone. They burned because the Americans had learned to fight differently, to refuse the kind of engagement where German technical superiority would prove decisive, to attack from positions of advantage with weapons specifically designed to kill heavy armor. They burned because industrial warfare rewards mass production and adaptability over perfection and elegance. They burned because wars are won not by the best weapons, but by the best systems for employing adequate weapons effectively. And in the end, burning was all that remained. The black smoke rising from destroyed tanks, German and American both, marking the places where men had fought and died for ground that would be given up or retaken, that mattered intensely in the moment and hardly at all in retrospect. The Ardennes offensive failed. The Reich contracted toward its final destruction. The war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion.